we are here as ResetDOC on Civilizations, which is a European organization that has a brother, a sister organization in ResetDOC's US, that is here represented by Jonathan Laurence, which is the chief executive of the American association. We are working together. We have also the let's say the partnership of Momentum Without Borders, which is an Arab organization based in Rabat that we have been working during last years together with. And with the support of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. So our issue is the Arab winter, what we call the Arab winter, bedtime means, and the Tunisian exception. Let me say that 10 years later, it is time to reflect on events which have aroused great hopes, but not only the hopes of revolutionary movements, agitated minorities or dreamers of better worlds or egalitarian utopias. Also that, but at the same time, the hopes of realistic observers of political and economic powers that were and are within the mainstream of the establishment of the Western capitals in Europe and the United States. The hopes of many of us were shrewdly calculated and measured at that time. I remember the title of a Foreign Affairs Man article at the end of 2011. The cover story was the Arab Spring. The title was Demystifying the Arab Spring, passing the differences between Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Lisa Anderson wrote it at the end of 2011. And I'm glad that she's here with us today. Demystifying, she said, which is not a term for a dreamer, but no one was under any illusion, knowing the basic data of the weakness of the societies involved, and then also of the explosive differences that divided them between secular and religious people, divisions very strong, and division also between, in the case of Syria especially, between Sunni and Shia and other religious components, and elsewhere ethnic and language differences that made even more explosive and centrifugal the Arab Spring. No one was illuded that it would have been an easy and glorious path of for democracy. Nevertheless, the demand for respect for human dignity, for human rights, the desire for justice and freedom from repressive regimes was strong and certainly contained promises, which one could hope at least in part could be fulfilled. This suggested realism. When Obama spoke in Cairo and Turkey in 2009, when the dossier of Turkey's accession to the European Union was still open, it really seemed that the season dominated by the conflict with radical Islam after 9/11 and after the disastrous war in Iraq, with what followed after other terrorist enterprises that hit Spain and England, and that would continue over the next decade, by the way. At that moment, it seemed that the course of things could take a new direction, that even the Turkish hegemony, or call it Neo-Ottoman, that we used to say at that time, Neo-Ottoman, as if it was able to develop a soft power capable of mixing the prospect of greater well-being and at the same time democracy, a possible democracy, greater justice, and a degree of freedom previously unknown in many of these countries, as was the case this hegemony was visible. In the case of the great television series of success, Turkish, but capable of conquering the Arab world of North Africa. All that seemed to help Turkey, too, seemed to help the Arab Spring in a fruitful direction. For different reasons, most of these hopes have been dashed or abandoned. The proof of government of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has failed, dominated by extremism and the lack of a government agenda. The repression of the army has brought back to power a military dictatorship, which I believe we can call worse than the previous regime. We are here today mourning, by the way, among other things, the death of a young Italian researcher, Giulio Regeni, murdered by the Egyptian services, and with a government that has so far prevented the courts from carrying out his duties. With another young Turkish researcher, Patrick George Zaki, who remains in prison for no plausible reason in Egypt. These are clearly only the few emerging cases of a repressive reality affecting hundreds and thousands of cases that do not reach the surface of the media. So after 10 years of meetings and dialogues with intellectuals and researchers from East and West that we have been carrying on from all over the world, which we held in Istanbul from 2007 to 2016. Here too, in Turkey, the repressive spiral has crushed freedom in a heavily serious way, forcing many free spirits into exile, keeping others in prison, and limiting everyone's freedom of expression. I don't want to go back over the story of many realistic promises that were shared by the ruling classes of the establishment, and not just some dreamers were disappointed. It is the subject of our work on this occasion and of the analysis that we will hear from the speaker of this conference. I only hope that the second part of the title of our meeting, the Tunisian exception, will survive our works. I say this with apprehension because I know that a great deal of critical reflection will be made on this point here. The fact is that one of the conditions for a long history of solid democracies to begin its course is the mutual recognition of opponents competing for votes. Historically, this is the crucial step, starting the democratic course. Elites fighting each other for the majority of votes accept the opposing side as legitimate, renounce violence, recognize the election result, and accept a peaceful alternation of governments. I'm sure you understand my allusion to Russia or to other countries. Doesn't sound ironic these days. While I say this, I am well aware that many things have happened over the last 10 years to the leading groups of European and Anglo-American democracies, which today appears much less stable than it was only in 2009, and also much less attractive to the rest of the world. Not to mention the lack of attractiveness of the American, English, or Western model to fight against the coronavirus. Populist movements have shaken and very heavily shaken the United States and Europe, but not only. And those premises of mutual peaceful acceptance and legitimacy no longer seem so peaceful. In Tunisia, however, to come back to the second part of our title, after a very difficult start, 2011, it was precisely the mutual recognition between secular people and secular parties and the Islamic political movement, exactly that recognition whose failure to fulfill was the root of the Egyptian catastrophe. I know that in this situation, political realism sometimes leads us to prefer stability over democracy, and also stability over human rights. Sometimes, let us admit that in some cases, this is the inevitable conclusion, even if many are willing to do so only on the skin of others and not on their own skin, on their own rights. However, I believe that this is a point that deserves to be discussed in depth. If the benefits of freedom, respect for human dignity, and the basic rights of the individual have once appeared as a real possibility, as has happened after a street vendor of Sidi Bouzid was called Mohammed Bouazizi, set himself in fire on December 17 of 2010, as has happened after that in several of the countries we are going to analyze here, I keep thinking that our choice cannot be a renunciation. So, welcome everybody to this meeting, and let's go to the work. Let's start our work with the first session with Soli Özel.
Good evening, everyone. Well, for those of you who are on our side of the globe, good evening. For those who are in the States, good morning or good afternoon. Very happy to be here. And one does wish, of course, that the 10th anniversary of the Arab revolts would at least have a fraction of the hopes that Giancarlo has just spoken about and the joy that was so much in display in public squares of many, many countries. My talk is entitled Between the Legacy of the Arab Revolts, Between Despair and Rebellion. And I guess the point about despair is pretty obvious, as is, in my judgment, the point about rebellion. And of course, the fear is that the second edition may be in a more restricted form of the Arab revolts in 2018, 2019, 2020, in places like the Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, would give us perhaps a more sustained air or aura of hope, but that doesn't look likely, and that damn COVID had also helped repressive regimes use it as a good excuse to actually quell the search for a more or better governance. So I'll start my talk with a view of my view of what had happened 10 years ago and how things have gone after the initial burst of hope. Almost at the zenith of the enthusiasm for the Arab revolts, when the Syrian struggle has not yet turned into the macabre story that it is, Yemen was not a total calamity, and Libya still held together, the duo of Robert Malley and Hussein Aga wrote what in retrospect turned out to be a very prescient, pessimistic assessment that went totally against the aura, the flair of the times. In their article published in the New York Review of Books entitled, "This is Not a Revolution," Malley and Aga wrote the following: "Darkness descends upon the Arab world, waste, death, and destruction attend a fight for a better life. Outsiders compete for influence and settle accounts. The peaceful demonstrations with which this began, the lofty values that inspired them, become distant memories. A scramble for power is unleashed without clear rules, values, or endpoint. It will not stop with regime change or survival. history does not move forward, as we are instinctively, perhaps intuitively prone to believe, it slips sideways. Not only did the two authors foretell the demise of that hopeful moment, just like in 1848, the springtime of nations, they even predicted, tragically on target, that even Fatah and the PLO will have no place in the new world. The two-state solution is no one's primary concern. It might expire not because of violence or settlements or America's inexpert role. It might perish of indifference. Now, unlike 1848, to which, of course, the Arab revolts were likened, the context, regionally or internationally, was not nearly as propitious as that of the mid-19th century, which the conditions in the mid-19th century Europe made it possible the realization of the goals of the rebels of 1848, even if they were crushed, because these were enacted at the end of the day by the conservative forces that came on top during those rebellions. That may have been the inexorable push of history at the time of an ascending new order in Europe, because of the cognitive orientation of the times, or idealism and creativity. And perhaps despite the violence used to quell the revolts at that time, the distance between the rulers and the ruled was not nearly as unbridgeable as that which obtained in the Middle East 10 years ago. And both a sense of noblesse oblige and competence in statecraft, not to mention the transformative dynamism of capitalism, helped shape a new domestic and international order. The context for those countries that had experienced the hopeful turmoil of that brief moment of elation was very different. A population explosion that coincided with substantial environmental degradation made the management of societal demands ever harder. Shortages of fresh water, drought, desertification, extreme heat, and dust storms have already shown the region's climate trajectory during this decade. Climate change was a contributing factor to the Arab Spring. Crop failures, especially in Syria, which spent the 5 years between 2006 and 2011 with severe droughts that led to a reduction in crops, slaughtering of animals that could not be fed, and the move of about 5% of the population from rural areas in desperate search for just life in urban areas. These conditions that had contributed immensely to the outbreak of bloody conflict in places like Syria and Yemen, the country that will run out of water before everyone else, continue to deteriorate relentlessly and will be affecting a region whose population is estimated to reach 1 billion by the end of the century, with the resources needed to manage that growth nowhere to be seen for the moment. This is the bleak picture of the region a decade after the momentous popular uprisings that concentrated in urban areas. As such, its own particularities notwithstanding, the Arab revolts were part of a wave of rebellions that shook different parts of the world, from Hong Kong to Chile, from Ukraine to the United States, from Turkey to Brazil to Israel. In almost all cases, the urban rebellions failed to get concrete results, mainly because what was legendary about this massive wave of protests globally, that they had no hierarchies, no leadership, no political affiliation, no particular political demands, and were based on communicative power, was also, or turned out to be also, their greatest weakness, as Zineb Tüfekçi, who has studied billions of tweets and Facebook posts, suggested in her book. A social movement, no matter how popular, widespread and vibrant, does not by itself generate desired political outcomes. And in the case of the Arab revolts, dignity, the rallying cry of the crowds, particularly the desperate unemployed youth, both unskilled and uneducated, and perhaps even more dramatically, in higher percentages as well, the educated. That did not translate in a sustained desire for democracy, however democratic the movement itself may have been. In fact, Joel Bainan, who did write recently a comparative analysis of Egypt and Tunisia, looking at their working class movements, argued that the working classes who have contributed tremendously to the mass movement in Egypt did not call for democracy or human rights, but they were mainly calling for better living conditions, probably better standards of organization, and to be able to actually get their rightful earnings. The three processes, in my judgment, made the Arab revolts possible by creating the conditions of deep discontent and vast accumulated grievances. Now, I studied revolutions probably more intensely and frequently in my very long university life than any other topic. I still don't know what actually makes a revolution, but I know enough theories. And on the one hand, of course, you have to look at, if you want, the longue durée or just structural conditions, state failures or what have you. And then there are also the moments which actually trigger things. For the Arab revolts, obviously the greater context are the ones that I'm going to mention, but there was also the world financial and economic crisis of 2008, and the increase in the price of wheat because of fires in Russia. That actually was an important contributing immediate factor. So the three processes that we witnessed in the 90s and the 2000s in a region which actually resisted fiercely attempts to change for the better, for better governance anyway, was one, the turns towards liberal, neoliberal economic policies in the region and the resulting increase in poverty levels, unemployment, and concentrations of wealth. Now, this goes particularly for, I guess, the working classes, because when you look at World Bank figures, most of those countries actually registered high growth rates in the decade that preceded the urban revolts. Their middle classes, as late as the 2003, 2004, 2005, according to Ishak Diwan's surveys and analyses, were not really particularly discontent, and they were not really calling for what it is that they started calling for come January of 2011. The second process was the narrowing of political networks of power in the region, symbolized by the increasingly prevalent move toward family rule, if not dynastic succession, among the republics as well as the monarchies. So inheritance of power in the republics was the contribution of the region to political science literature, I suppose. Finally, the third process was the increasing reliance of all regimes on the coercive and surveillance power of their police and security forces. perhaps one can add to this, if not the collaboration, but the indifference of global powers to what went on in the Middle East, which remained the one part of the world that did not join the wave in the 1990s of more open or more democratic political systems. One place where a decent election really could not be held. Yet, of course, a lot of developments had unintended consequences. The democracy agenda of Bush, however hypocritical it might have seemed to many around the world, did make some degree of impact. And for instance, in Egypt, you did have Muslim Brotherhood members joining the parliament or being elected to parliament, even if in non-party tickets. And as well, during the 2000s, there were political movements, social movements that actually sought to push the systems to open further, with not much success. At the end of the day, counter-revolution at the regional level came out triumphant in many of the countries that experienced the breeze of freedom and quest for justice. Tunisia, the exception that proved the rule perhaps, had in it well-institutionalized, even if halfway co-opted trade union, UGTT, an actor that could act as a counterweight to powers that be. No such autonomous or well-entrenched institution, to the best of my knowledge, existed outside of government power in any of the other countries, with relative exception that we can say for Egypt. Elsewhere, the hopes have been drowned either by brutal regime responses or regional power interventions, or by the sheer incompetence of the new rulers, as well as by the conniving institutions such as the Egyptian military, that not only overthrew a remarkably unprepared and unsuccessful Ikhwan government, but took back the regime that it built after 1952 from the hands of the security forces and the police. The coincidence of the revolts and the counter-revolution they triggered with an accelerating indifference, if not, they triggered, okay. There was a coincidence between the revolts and the counter-revolution they triggered and the accelerating indifference, if not retreat, by the United States from the region. That has also led to a reconfiguration of the power balances in the region. I think it is justifiably, one can justifiably ask, and I haven't yet read the relevant sections in President Obama's recently published memoir, how did he move from that very hopeful speech in Cairo to basically saying in 2012, this is hopeless, we should just get out, and then basically have no Syria policy to speak of? Or as he explained in 2006 in his probably famous interview with The Atlantic, the article entitled The Obama Doctrine, that he didn't think the United States ought to carry the burden of the region. And that is a big problem in the following sense. The United States gets in, does something, invades Iraq, breaks a lot of the China around, and then washes or wishes to wash its hands off the mess that it has created. And everybody is supposed to actually pick up the pieces. And that is maybe something we would be discussing. This is not to put the troubles of the region all in the basket of or in the camp of the United States, but that is indeed an important factor in my view. The global powers' desire to settle its account with Iran and wash its hands of the conflicts in the Gulf led to the nascent alignment between the Gulf Arab countries and the State of Israel, unified by their enmity to, fear of, and anger against the Islamic Republic. As disarray in the Arab world continued with the number of failed states rising, the three non-Arab countries strategically became more important in determining the geopolitical fate of the region than ever before. That is Iran, Israel, and Turkey. In my judgment, and that may not be shared by many, Islamism in power actually failed in its test of managing complex countries and in producing a governance project. Instead, it could only offer an ideological model that, however conservative the societies may have been, went against the grain of modernized urban societies that had other demands from their rulers. The ideological zeal was not even a poor substitute for lack of governance, provision of employment, generation of better living standards, and presenting a transparent administration that actually heard and responded to concrete public demands. Parts of the legacy of the Arab revolts were actually related intimately to the ill-advised, ill-thought-out, and ill-fated American misadventure in Iraq. The sectarian divisions, battles that began to spring in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution that Kim Gattas, among others, has presented in her book, Black Wave, but did not really fully penetrate the populations of the region, but came to full flowering in the wake of the Gulf War, the decade of maximum pressure on Saddam Hussein, and of course, the invasion of Iraq, which changed the order of things in the Mashriq. The ouster of Saddam Hussein and the empowerment of the Shia combined to generate a geopolitical cum ideological divide that was exacerbated by the emergence of jihadi fury. The absence of good governance, the manipulation of sectarianism for political purposes, and the inability to build a nation or a sentiment of society or a public opened the gates for ISIS that, whatever its undesirable and brutal characteristics, provided a mode of governance. That it was built upon hatred of the Shia and the subjugation of women and other miscreants probably was its Achilles heel, yet there was no time to test this as they were wiped out by superior force, but nowadays they may be coming back. Then I want to touch upon Saudi Arabia very briefly, and I'll end with the 2008, the second edition of the Arab Spring. As I see it, Saudi Arabia got some lessons or learned some lessons from the Arab Spring and what had unfolded afterwards. And much as I dislike the regime, if we're going to put it in political science terms, what the Crown Prince is trying to do is to transform the Saudi kingdom from a family enterprise to an absolutist state. Whether or not he can succeed, I don't know. It doesn't look like he might be successful. Temperamentally, he may be ill-suited for that kind of project, but that is the project at hand. At a time or on the very eve of possibly incrementally declining returns for oil producing countries around the world, whether or not the Saudis will be able to actually transcend their current predicament, perhaps is one of the most important questions pertaining to the Middle East. And the efforts, sincere or not, to actually move away from exporting Wahhabism, seeing the links between the jihadi furor that hit them as well and their official doctrine, is an experiment worth watching, and how it will end remains to be seen. The geopolitical contestation continues, and now we have not just, we no longer truly have an Arab-Israeli conflict, but we do have a Shia-Sunni conflict, Iran versus the Sunni Arab countries, Iran and its allies, non-state allies in the region. But you also have a split in the Sunni camp, and you see the competition between Turkey on the one hand, along with Qatar, in support ideologically of the Muslim Brotherhood, opposing geopolitically and ideologically the camp led by Saudi Arabia. And that contest is fierce, especially the one between the United Arab Emirates and the Turkish Republic. I'll finish with the second round of the Arab Spring. One does wish to be very hopeful about what had happened in the Sudan, what has been going on in Algeria, which is now basically stopped, the demands in Iraq and Lebanon for a non-sectarian public and political order, and one sympathizes, empathizes, and wishes to be as supportive as possible in a rather impossible environment for those who brave the powers that be, who brave security forces, forces that they cannot really overcome, and continue to fight. Do these movements, particularly in Iraq and Lebanon, especially given the fact that sectarian organizations have discredited themselves or have been discredited, can we then say that sectarianism or the post-sectarian era is finally upon us, and that there is still hope to rebuild a functioning pluralist system in multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian Arab and other countries? Can societies this time around, with much reduced resources, with a bankrupt Lebanon, prevail over power structures? Would the rapacious elites of the region finally see or recognize the advantages for stability and their own good to get into an effort to build a more coherent and responsive system? Because if I'm not going to blame either religion or ethnicity for the failures of the Arab world or the Middle Eastern region, and therefore I have to look at the elites and their failure to actually come up with a positive agenda, the absence of which gives us ISIS as the dystopic architect of a possible new order. So this is, in my view, the challenge for the region on the 10th anniversary of the Arab revolts. The youth of the region provide some hope and aspiration. One would wish that they would get support from an exhausted, embittered, disenchanted, and increasingly indifferent Western world to actually move forward. Whether that is really likely to come, I don't know. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Soli Özel. Thank you really for your in-depth analysis, so rich of insights and suggestions for us. And so thank you, Professor. Soli Özel is currently a senior lecturer at Istanbul Kadir Has University, and you can find all his rich biography in our chat. And we decided to publish it because it's really too long to explain just in a couple of minutes. So now let's introduce our first panel, which is on frozen revolutions. So we decided to give this kind of title to the Egyptian one and the Libyan revolution. So before giving the floor to Professor Arturo Varvelli, let's introduce him briefly. Varvelli is a director of Rome Office of European Council on Foreign Relations and senior policy fellow. And he will explain, he will talk about Libyan revolution and evolution, because Libya is a focus country. So thank you, Professor Özel again, and Professor Varvelli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, especially thanks to Federica and Giancarlo. I'm very happy to be here with all of these distinguished speakers. So I think that the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring is an excellent opportunity to analyze the current situation in Libya. And who spoke before me have already given an extraordinary overview of this historical phase, and thus it will be much easier to introduce the topic Libya. I know that I can speak in Italian, so I prefer to speak in my mother tongue, and I will make a language switch from English to Italian. So, allora parliamo della Libia e diciamo di come questo diciamo questa io però sento la traduzione, mi dà un po' fastidio.
Scusi professore,
posso
se
abbassare?
per parlare
Sì.
Se lei vuole rimuovere, cioè rimuova l'interpretazione, così lei non lo sente.
Ok.
Se fa off sull'interpretazione.
Sorry. Perfetto, scusate. Naturalmente partiamo dalla Libia come diciamo rivoluzione.
Sorry Arturo, in the meantime I wanted to exploit this short pause to say that if we want to ask to Soli Özel to stay with us, because there will be some interaction and some discussion, including his opening presentation.
I would not think of leaving. I'm here.
Okay, no, I know, but I wanted to be sure that so we can have some discussion about all, two interventions coming now, and also the previous one by Soli. Okay. Sorry.
Figurati Giancarlo. Parliamo della Libia come rivoluzione, diciamo, congelata, ma anche possiamo parlarne in questo momento anche quasi come conflitto congelato. Quindi diciamo la Libia ha visto in 10 anni un passaggio da rivoluzione congelata a conflitto congelato, e questo testimonia quanta difficoltà si sia avuta nel processo, diciamo, rivoluzionario libico. I motivi quali sono? I motivi sono numerosi e molto complessi e hanno una natura, diciamo, interna, in particolare al regime di Gheddafi, e però ci sono anche motivazioni esterne che stanno nel ruolo degli attori internazionali, nel ruolo che gli attori internazionali hanno giocato in questa crisi. Le motivazioni interne sono molto importanti. La Libia non è stata una rivoluzione compiuta, io direi che è stata piuttosto un tentativo rivoluzionario che si è tramutato in una sorta di rivolta, e lo è stata soprattutto perché il regime di Gheddafi era ancora forte. È stata una mezza rivoluzione. Una mezza rivoluzione perché il regime di Gheddafi non era solamente un regime dittatoriale e molto naturalmente violento, condizione tipica dei regimi autocratici, ma oltre a ciò era ed è e rimane un rentier state, cioè uno Stato che basa le proprie entrate, i propri introiti, quasi esclusivamente dalla vendita di idrocarburi all'estero. E questo che cosa comporta? Comporta il fatto che si venga a creare un legame diretto tra chi governa e chi è governato, tra diciamo, chi esercita l'opera di patronato, in questo caso Muammar Gheddafi, e il cittadino che riceveva dalla mano stessa di Gheddafi, diciamo, il pane quotidiano, ma non solo. Non si governa un paese per 42 anni come lo governò Gheddafi, solamente con il bastone, e purtroppo bastonate ne sono arrivate molte ai cittadini libici, ma lo ha governato anche con la carota, e la carota era una ridistribuzione di questa rendita alla popolazione. Certamente una ridistribuzione ineguale, e questa è una delle cause fondamentali talvolta delle rivoluzioni, delle rivolte o dei sommovimenti. Talvolta non si fanno e non si compiono e non si scende in strada perché ci si sente in qualche maniera poveri, ma perché ci si sente invece in qualche maniera usurpati di qualcosa che spetterebbe di diritto, e ci si sente in qualche modo trattati in maniera diversa rispetto ad altri concittadini. Quindi è talvolta la disuguaglianza che ha spinto a scendere in piazza e a prendere le armi, ad esempio, a molti giovani cittadini della Cirenaica. Non è un caso che fu la Cirenaica, la regione attorno a Bengasi e alle altre città di quell'area, a impugnare le armi e a scendere in piazza tra il 15 e il 17 febbraio del 2011. Non è un caso perché nella ridistribuzione di questa rendita il regime di Gheddafi era molto attento a chi abitava in Tripolitania, agli amici del clan Gheddafi, al sistema di alleanze delle famiglie vicine alla famiglia Gheddafi e al sistema di potere tipico del regime di Muammar Gheddafi, mentre era più lontano e più disattento a quanto avveniva in Cirenaica. E questa disuguaglianza si è protratta non solo nel corso di 42 anni di governo del regime di Gheddafi, ma è rimasta anche alla base di alcune rivalità importanti nella fase post-gheddafiana. Quello che noi abbiamo visto nel conflitto del 2011 è stato un conflitto civile che ha coinvolto appunto le due regioni, una Cirenaica che si sollevava contro i lealisti della Tripolitania, ma che nel corso del tempo, nel corso di questi 10 anni, è mutata ma ha conservato caratteristiche di regionalità. È emerso un leader, il generale Haftar in Cirenaica, che ha fatto esattamente presa su queste motivazioni per legittimare il proprio potere nell'area, e lo ha fatto rivendicando e riuscendo a rivendicare un ruolo per conto e per nome di cittadini che in qualche maniera si sentivano di serie B nel regime di Gheddafi. Questo sta alla base ancora oggi, io penso, della frattura o di alcune delle fratture che sono tuttora presenti in Libia. Ma poi ci sono stati gli attori esterni. Gli attori esterni non sono stati meno influenti degli attori interni nella crisi libica, anzi direi che gli attori esterni sono stati ancora più influenti da questo punto di vista. Gli attori esterni hanno sin da subito nella crisi libica avuto un ruolo importante. Questo ruolo è ben evidente da una altra caratteristica della crisi libica, della rivolta o rivoluzione libica. È stata fin da subito una rivolta armata. Questa non è una caratteristica che noi abbiamo visto né nella vicina Tunisia e né nell'Egitto. Qui abbiamo visto due autocrati che risiedevano da tempo e governavano da tempo entrambi i paesi, che però, come dire, una volta che i cittadini o i rivoltosi, i rivoluzionari sono scesi in piazza, hanno abbandonato il potere per diverse ragioni. In Libia non abbiamo visto questo. Abbiamo visto certamente un regime molto più autoritario che ha dato una risposta militare, Ma dall'altra parte abbiamo visto anche rivoluzionari che erano fin da subito o fin quasi dalle prime fasi armati. E quindi questa è una caratteristica importante che deve essere tenuta presente. La rivoluzione in Libia è fin da subito deragliata. Fin da subito gli attori esterni hanno cercato e hanno voluto metterci un cappello, farsi in qualche maniera mentori di questa fase di trasformazione. Lo hanno fatto certamente i paesi della sponda nord del Mediterraneo, in particolare la Francia e la Gran Bretagna, che hanno voluto quell'intervento armato, al seguito del quale poi è dovuta un po' controvoglia intervenire la NATO e gli Stati Uniti e in ulteriore battuta anche l'Italia, ma lo hanno fatto forse con ancora maggiore intensità, volontà e desiderio di abbattere il regime di Gheddafi, i paesi del mondo arabo. Paesi del mondo arabo che però si sono subito divisi dopo la caduta del regime di Gheddafi il 20 ottobre del 2011. Si sono subito divisi proprio perché tutte quelle influenze e tutte quelle visioni molto diverse del conflitto sono prontamente comparse. Anche visioni in parte ideologiche che stanno alla base di questa divisione e che sono alla base dell'attuale divisione diciamo dei paesi arabi in questo periodo. La Libia è quindi è rimasta vittima di un conflitto più ampio, quello che noi definiamo una sorta di proxy war, una guerra di prossimità che è fatta molto spesso da attori locali, libici, per nome di qualcuno che non sta in Libia. E presto il generale Haftar si è sostanzialmente trasformato in un agente che si faceva garante di interessi altrui, di interessi esterni. E questo è stato il suo secondo forte motivo di radicamento nella crisi libica. Da una parte è riuscito a coalizzare attorno a sé elementi della Cirenaica che erano disillusi verso la gestione della transizione politica a Tripoli, ma dall'altra parte allo stesso modo lui ha cercato di farsi garanti degli interessi di alcuni attori esterni sempre più importanti nella crisi libica, in particolare l'Egitto, in particolare gli Emirati Arabi, la Russia e anche purtroppo i nostri amici francesi. Per questo noi possiamo pensare che, date le circostanze, sia diciamo di una crisi ampia a livello ideologico nell'area medio orientale, che vede frapposte soprattutto Turchia e Qatar da una parte e dall'altra Emirati Arabi, Egitto e Arabia Saudita, la crisi libica possa essere in qualche modo descritta anche come una crisi, diciamo, un conflitto congelato. Un conflitto congelato perché l'intensità del confronto attuale è molto debole, però sono anche deboli onestamente le possibilità di risolvere una situazione così complessa che vede attori interni ed attori esterni, diciamo, accavallarsi negli interessi. Abbiamo visto le Nazioni Unite nell'ultimo periodo molto attive, molto più attive nel passato, e certamente hanno ottenuto dei risultati che in passato non hanno ottenuto. Abbiamo visto un'Europa un po' più attiva del passato, specialmente su input, io penso, di una Germania che ha voluto intervenire in maniera più attiva di quanto non avesse voluto intervenire nel recente passato, e mi riferisco in particolare alla conferenza di Berlino, che non ha avuto il merito di risolvere la crisi, ciò è evidente, ma che ha avuto il merito di riportare in Europa, diciamo, le trattative diplomatiche. e di ristabilire una roadmap che non fosse guidata e condotta da attori esterni al quadro europeo, ma anche esterni, diciamo, agli interessi dei libici, e mi riferisco al tentativo tra russi e turchi di sistemare con sostanzialmente un nuovo modello Astana la crisi libica. Quali sono le prospettive della crisi libica? Quindi io penso che nella migliore delle soluzioni noi ci dovremmo trovare davanti a una sorta di conflitto congelato. Certamente rimangono possibilità di escalation ulteriori fin quando saranno presenti sul terreno mercenari di entrambe le parti. Wagner Group combatte con il generale Haftar e tiene delle posizioni saldamente. Dall'altra parte abbiamo visto la Turchia molto attiva. Sostanzialmente è alla Turchia che il governo di Tripoli, un governo sostenuto dalle Nazioni Unite e dalla comunità internazionale, a parole ma poco nei fatti, questo governo deve sostanzialmente alla Turchia gran parte della propria riconoscenza per esistere ancora sostanzialmente. È la Turchia che si è fatta carico di un intervento militare per sorreggerlo, e in questo momento e nel prossimo futuro immagino voglia la Turchia rimanere un attore essenziale e presente sul terreno libico. Quindi è molto difficile pensare sia che le cose possano andare molto meglio, ma anche che le cose possano andare molto peggio di quanto sta accadendo. Siamo in una fase nella quale, ad esempio, due attori principali come Turchia e Egitto ancora non sono pronti probabilmente a parlarsi direttamente, ma hanno preso forse anche atto che hanno poco da guadagnarci entrambi in un conflitto aperto sul terreno libico. Hanno tanti interessi in comune, a cominciare dal Mediterraneo dell'Est, hanno la necessità di trovare una quasi coesistenza pacifica di qualche tipo, non sono ancora pronti a diciamo, parlarsi direttamente, ma questo fa pensare che l'escalation possa non essere così prossima. Nel mezzo ci stanno due attori che restano molto importanti in questa crisi, che sono gli Stati Uniti e l'Europa, che potrebbero avere una capacità, io penso, di game changer, di cambiare le regole del gioco, che però insomma sono in questo momento ancora un po' distanti dalla crisi. L'Europa sappiamo bene che difficilmente sa sostituirsi agli Stati Uniti in questioni di hard power. L'Europa è però brava a fare la pace, è più brava a fare mediazioni. Bisognerebbe che vi fosse un ruolo attivo, ma questo potrebbe essere consentito solamente, diciamo, da una nuova pistola fumante sul tavolo delle trattative, e questa potrebbe essere solamente la pistola degli Stati Uniti. Gli Stati Uniti dovrebbero in qualche maniera essere più presenti politicamente nella crisi e avere una mano all'Unione Europea in questo momento. Io mi fermerei qua.
Grazie professor Varvelli, grazie anche per questa coda finale sul ruolo degli Stati Uniti, che ha in qualche modo anche anticipato alcune osservazioni che immagino siano venute in mente anche ad altri ascoltatori rispetto all'intervento del professor Özel. Vediamo dopo eventualmente di confrontarci ancora un attimo, e la prego di rimanere con noi e seguire il prossimo intervento. Let's introduce Professor Amr Hamzawy, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law in Stanford University. Professor Hamzawy, so sorry we are a little bit late, but you can have all the time because unfortunately Professor Benalla in the second panel won't join us because of family problems. So you have all your time.
Yes. So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm happy to see Giancarlo and to see Jonathan and different familiar names. So hope everyone is staying safe and sound. And right, let me start by before getting to Egypt by trying to frame my discussion in the context of four big tensions I feel are quite relevant in understanding what has been happening since 2011, including the second wave. Tension one is between democratic rights, human rights, democratic freedoms, and governance. And I believe it's been misinterpretation to see the uprisings in 2011 in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere, as well as the second wave, which Soli referred to in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and Algeria, to see them as simply driven by democratic demand. They have been driven by democratic demand, but by governance demand as well. These uprisings in the two waves, in 2011 as well as in 2018, 19, and 20, have been driven by calls for fighting corruption, for inclusive governance frameworks, for better distribution of social and economic revenues. And we cannot understand the trigger, be it in Tunisia and Egypt or even elsewhere, as well as the different triggers in the second wave in Lebanon, searching for a post-sectarian governance framework to basically move beyond corrupt sectarian forces and a very corrupt and imbalanced distribution of social and economic goods among the Lebanese population. And the same goes for Iraq, and the same goes for Algeria and for Sudan. So the very first tension we really have to go back and revisit and reassess is the tension between the populace in different Arab countries moving forward to demand the democracy, to demand better representation, to demand a say via elections, via regular elections, via traditional mechanisms of the rule of law, but as well to demand better governance. Better governance in the sense of fighting corruption, better distribution of social and economic revenues, and so on and so forth. That's number one. The second tension, which I feel really takes us back to Soli's presentation, is the tension between organized social and political forces and informal social and political forces. And one of the reasons why the fate of the democratic uprising or popular uprisings, one should say, in 2011, as well as in 2018, 19, 20, has been quite different. I mean, you can compare Tunisia and Egypt on the one hand, but you can also compare Sudan on the one hand and Algeria, or Sudan and Lebanon, Sudan and Iraq. One of the main factors explaining the different fate of the popular uprisings is the combination of formal and informal forces, organized and informal forces we have at stake. And in a way, wherever we have been looking at an organized civil society arena, an organized political arena, as in Tunisia, as in Sudan, where trade unions have been strongly, historically strong, where political parties, especially in Sudan, have been historically strong in spite of the long autocratic rule of Bashir. Wherever we find strong, organized, collective action platforms, be it trade unions, civil society organizations, political parties, and less of informal networks, or wherever we find a drive to organize quickly. The Sudanese uprising has been an impressive uprising in the sense of quickly organizing. We're not waiting after the days in which Bashir was ousted, not waiting long before organizing in fronts, in political parties, in different collective action platforms. So organization seems to be, collective organization, collective action platforms seem to be a driving factor for success, for relative success in the case of Tunisia and Sudan, as opposed to the cases of Syria, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, with all due differences between them. But here we have a tension between organized collective action platforms and informal networks of young people, of activists, and so on and so forth, which lose momentum roughly quick, which lose momentum roughly soon, as we have been seeing in different countries across the region. The third tension, which I would like to draw your attention to, is basically the tension between politics on the one hand and social and economic power structures on the other hand. And I believe, once again, Algeria, for example, in the second wave is a very difficult case to expect what will happen next, and is a very difficult case to expect real reform, governance reform, or real democratic reform, simply because of the convergence of political on the one hand and socio-economic power structures on the other hand. And wherever in the countries where we've been having a bit of this convergence between political power structures and social and economic power structures, we've been seeing more openings in these countries. Once again, I'm referring primarily to Sudan and Tunisia. Of course, one can say, but here's a sectarian component comes in between, that Lebanon and Iraq have been witnessing a bit of this convergence between political power structures, religious-based power structures, and social and economic power structures, and a plurality of actors. But the sectarian governance framework, the corrupt sectarian governance framework, has impeded development. But so we have a tension, a third tension between political power structures and social and economic power structures. Finally, which is, and here external powers come in, it's basically the question of whether you are in a strategic, in a strategically important place, or in a strategically less relevant place. I guess Libya, as the previous speaker was referring to, is a highly contested conflict arena. Many regional as well as international interests come in. If you compare Libya to Lebanon, where traditionally we have the US and France playing a leading role from an external actor perspective, traditionally speaking, Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand regionally. Of course, Israel comes in as well. But the big difference between a constellation of external, regional, and international actors, where a plurality of actors and new dynamics have been interfering in recent years, or where we have been seeing basically more of the same as before the uprisings. The comparison between Libya on the one hand and Lebanon on the other hand. So these four tensions, to my mind, explain to an extent the differences in the fate of uprisings across the region. Now, let me, based on that, come to Egypt and to tell you that maybe this is where my research has been going in the last 2 years as well. I've been getting more interested in understanding changes in the governance framework in Egypt, and I see, of course, I can take on board what Soli referred to in relation to, and what I've been writing about, what Lisa Anderson has been writing about, and many others. The change to, and what Giancarlo referred to, the change to, or the return to an autocracy, which is at different levels, more repressive, less inclusive, more driven by security forces, as opposed or as compared to the autocracy of pre-2011 times. But in order to add to the discussion, I believe it's important to look at governance changes in Egypt since 2013. So we definitely have a return to an autocracy, to a new autocracy, which is more controlled by security services, which is more controlled by a combination of military, police, and intelligence actors. However, we're seeing as well an emergence of a governance framework which is less corrupt than what we had before 2011. We're seeing the emergence of a governance framework, which is to an extent driven by technocratic expertise as well. So we're seeing new constellations between civilian on the one hand and military actors within the state apparatus in Egypt in recent years. We're seeing the emergence of strong technocratic institutions, the role of the cabinet, the role of the prime minister, the role of key technocratic and female ministers who basically have been driving, for example, Egypt's response to COVID-19 since February, March 2020. So number one, yes, of course, the overall make of the Egyptian state apparatus and of Egyptian politics does reveal what we in various ways have been observing in recent years: a return to autocracy, more repressive autocracy, a dominance of military and police institutions, and so on and so forth. But we're seeing the beginnings of a change within the governance structure where civilian institutions matter a bit more than what has been the case since 2011. And probably it's even a return to a facet of the Mubarak autocracy, which was not appreciated as much before 2011, which was an interplay, more of a competitive, contestation-based interplay between civilian institutions on the one hand, or civilian power holders on the one hand, and non-civilian power holders on the other hand. So technocratic expertise, a different governance framework, which is driven by technocracy and not only by repression. That's an interesting point, which I see in Egypt. A second interesting point is the fact that the ruling establishment is catering to the governance demands, not only rhetorically, as well as in terms of public policy designs. They cater to social and economic demands of Egyptians. And once again, I started by highlighting the fact that we've been having a tension between governance demands on the one hand and democracy demands on the other hand. And the current ruling establishment caters to governance demands. Sometimes they package it as social and economic rights. Sometimes they package it as modernization. Sometimes they package it differently, but they are for sure catering to social and economic demands, bread and butter issues, which are relevant in Egypt, catering to fighting persisting social and economic crises, including anti-corruption campaigns, which to an extent have been successful in recent years. A third interesting facet, which I see in Egypt as well, is an attempt by, of course, while sidelining civil society actors, while sidelining formal political actors, Egypt does not have a competitive or a contestation-based formal political arena, and informal actors as well as formal actors have been pushed aside, are pressured, are cracked down upon, and so on and so forth. However, we're seeing the emergence of a state supportive new elite, or I would say a set of actors which are being groomed by the power centers within the state apparatus to play that role of a new political elite, containing military, civilian, non-civilian elements. And if you look at the elections which just happened in Egypt, of course, not competitive, but the parliamentary elections for the two chambers which just happened, you clearly see an attempt very similar to, it reminds me of the 1950s and 1960s under Nasser in Egypt, so the creation of a new political elite. Of course, under authoritarian parameters, under autocratic parameters, but it remains interesting to see whether competition will happen, whether any contestation will happen between these different actors. And it restores a bit of politics. I mean, it's no longer sort of a politically a dead place. There is a bit of competition within the state apparatus itself, old elites, new elites. And some of you will remember that these were the discussions we were having before 2011. Finally, a final important change which I see happening in Egypt is the re-emergence of a nationalist discourse, once again, reminiscent of the 1950s and 1960s. It does play into sort of the weakness of the Egyptian state in the years of the uprising in 2011, 2012 until 2013, it puts forward a nationalist, to an extent, a populist discourse where Egypt is being portrayed as a state regaining its strength. And in a way, in doing so, it caters to some of the very popular notions among Egyptians as well. So if you monitor the discourse of the government in Egypt carefully, it never addresses a regime or a government. It always addresses the Egyptian state when it talks to the people. So these are, if you wish, facets of an overall authoritarian reality, of an overall regression in terms of human rights, in terms of civil liberties. These facets are interesting to keep in mind. One, because technocracy in itself is an important value in the region. And we see attempts in highly authoritarian governments, in highly authoritarian places, to push forward that notion of, we're not building a democratic government, but we're building a technocratically able government. Saudi Arabia, less corrupt, the UAE, able and less corrupt Egypt, and so on and so forth. I guess Algeria might go in the same direction under Tebboune. It remains to be seen. Secondly, besides technocracy, that the drive toward catering to governance needs of wide segments of the Egyptian population, a big failure on the side of the democratic actors in 2011 and 2012, and an entry point for forces of the establishment of the state apparatus, civilian and non-civilian, to basically land victories among Egyptians by catering to their democratic, to their social and economic needs. Post-COVID-19 times are a case in point. Thirdly, the drive to create new elites, new state-loyal elites, state-serving elites, which ultimately would create some competition and some contestation, not only among civilian and non-civilian centers, but within the state apparatus in general. And finally, that drive within Egypt to push forward a nationalist discourse, sometimes colored in a populist fashion, sometimes impacted by reference to traditional values, but at any rate catering to that notion of a state or a nation, a grand nation, which is lost since the end of the 1960s, since 1967, went in too many misguided directions, and now coming back to be that strong state once again, which would explain why Egypt is playing, besides strategic interests, of course, the interference of Egypt for national security, driven by national security considerations, Egypt's role in Libya, Egypt's role in Sudan, and elsewhere. So these are sort of my points with regard to Egypt around the big or the grand narrative of the failure of democratic transition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Hamzawy. I'd suggest that we go on without the break, but just let me know if you agree with me, in order to give the time to Professor Özel, if he is still available, to react to our first panel, and eventually to add something on United States, Saudi Arabia, and Iran relationships, according to him, in the new year. So, Professor Özel.
Thank you very much for both presentations. I'll start with the Libya one on its geopolitical dimension, because Turkey is, of course, involved. It has taken a side, and by taking a side, it has also disturbed the plans, the goals of the other side. And for having done that, it is now at the crosshair of France in particular, but definitely of the United Arab Emirates and others as well. It also brought Libya, in my view, or it turned Libya into a problem that is not limited to Libya itself, but it made it part of a much larger problem, that is the problem of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in that sense, for the life of me, I couldn't understand why the Europeans were not, obviously they were not blind, but why they would let such a problem fester, not put more efforts, leave maybe Italy alone in its fight, and allow or create the conditions for Russia to become their southern neighbor as well. That's truly, for me, that was a mind-boggling reality as I saw it unfold. In a sense, I would argue, independent of which side most of the European countries may have been in Libya, Turkey obviously pursued its own interests, but it also served a European purpose, in my judgment, by basically putting limits to what Russia could do in Libya. And in return, Russia and others have put a limit to what Turkey would want to do in Libya. And that is, when Turkey wanted to move all the way to Sirte in order to be able to use the oil resources there, everybody said, no, no, you cannot do that. And Turkey had to stop. So that is how I see the intervention of Turkey, that is making Libya, the Libyan question, part of a larger Eastern Mediterranean question. Second, drawing a line on what Russia could do in Libya. But beyond that, the question of Libya, I suppose, or at least the way I see it is, how do you reconstruct, or how do you actually construct a state in Libya? How can you get diverse forces, disparate regional powers with very different interests to actually agree on a national project? Is that even possible? And that is a question for you, Professor Varvelli. Is it really possible to create a national project in Libya? I don't know the answer to that. That is not a place that I follow very closely. On Hamzawy's presentation, it is actually music to my ear on the issue of governance, not necessarily on the issue of democratic and human rights, obviously. What I heard him say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I heard him say is that what I think is being attempted in Saudi Arabia is also being attempted in Egypt. But based on my reading, this is also happening at an immense social cost. That is the streamlining of administration, emphasis on governance, paying attention to services, trying to cut down on corruption, but in doing so, using hopefully resources much more efficiently. But the translation in reality for a large segment of the population, of course, is unemployment, because the Egyptian state is no longer going to employ every college graduate. And there is just not enough production of jobs in the economic system for a very rapidly increasing workforce to be actually absorbed. Now, I would wonder if Amr could respond to this and tell us if that is seen as a problem, and if the technocracy is trying to develop projects or plans in order to deal with this problem. The population of Egypt in 2011 was, I think, 84 million. Today, Egypt's population is somewhere between 99 and 102 million. And that is in a country where the water resources are rapidly depleting. I think the desert is eating into arable land. And if the Ethiopians ultimately build their dam, I don't know what kind of impact exactly it's going to have on Egypt. So if if a more technocratic, if a more scientific, if a more streamlined administrative structure is being built in Egypt, what are the long-term possibilities for Egypt with that kind of pressure upon its resources of all kind to actually succeed in meeting that challenge? That would be my question. Finally, the United States, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, other Gulf countries versus Iran, and what Turkey might do. We are all investing heavily, obviously, in the Biden administration. Everybody is expecting a lot after the rather turbulent period, the still continuing turbulent period of Donald Trump. My sense is that the Biden administration will be serious about repairing transatlantic relations, certainly serious about stopping to divide stopping the Trump policy of trying to divide the European Union. And they are also very intent on rebuilding or reforging NATO so that it will be a more cohesive force. This would necessitate, in return from the Europeans, much more of a contribution to the security structure. I'm not sure that would be exactly what Emmanuel Macron has in mind when he talks about security autonomy. I doubt it, but certainly the United States, if it's going to be interested in Europe at all, it would demand of the Europeans much more contribution for the transatlantic alliance, because at the end of the day, if we're going to be realistic, probably, China is America's main challenge, and how much need it has of Europe in order to deal with that challenge ought to be a question that needs to be seriously asked. A big difference between the Biden and the Bush administration, the Trump administration, of course, is going to be that the Bidenites will see Russia as a much more serious rival than Trump did, and accordingly, their policies will be geared towards containing or at least limiting the damage that Russia is capable of inflicting. So what will they do on Iran? I guess we're all witnessing and probably holding our breath, hoping that Israel and Saudi Arabia will not succeed in provoking the Iranians enough so that the Iranians will do something rash, and that will basically chain Biden, who wants to actually rekindle and revitalize the JCPOA agreement. Even under the best of circumstances, I'm afraid that is going to be a very difficult task, particularly if the Senate remains in Republican hands. It will be a difficult task because I really don't see how one can find ways of persuading the Iranians to actually change their foreign policy in the Middle East, as most of the Gulf countries also demand. Now, that is where I think Russia, China on the one hand, and definitely the European three ought to be able to play a constructive role by playing the mediators and hopefully facilitating or showing the way to move ahead with the rekindling JCPOA to the Biden administration. It may be a tough job. It is a tough job, as I said, particularly if the Senate is in Republican hands, and the irresponsibility of the Republicans appear to have no bounds, as we're witnessing today. Beyond that, once Biden is in power, and there is a different approach to Iran, and there is a different approach to Saudi Arabia, and not so much to Israel, will the American administration be interested in investing in a reconciliation in the Gulf region to reduce the tensions so that it could actually move away more easily from the Middle East, which by now is accepted to be a big burden by almost all parties in the United States. Final point. Containment of Iran, I think, is still going to be important, and the US will try to do this, I think, by using the powers and resources of its allies in the region. And that's what will make, in my view, a Turkey that may be more communicative and more diplomatically oriented, a partner for the Biden administration. How Turkey will be able to overcome the hurdle of S-400s that were not just bought, but also tested, especially with Katsa included in the defense bill, I really don't know. That will necessitate imaginative diplomacy, and it will also necessitate that Turkey ought to be much more serious in improving its relations with Israel in particular, maybe Egypt, and that would require that Turkey give up on an ideological foreign policy, which puts priority on the supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe if Qatar and Saudi Arabia finally start getting along, and that's the price the Saudis will have to pay to the Biden administration, I guess. And if the Qataris are persuaded not to be as big champions of different branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as they are today, maybe then that will lead Turkey to actually drop the ideological fixations, at least to a certain extent, and basically follow a much more realistic foreign policy. So far, Turkey believes it's been successful, and it has been, by some definition, a successful foreign policy in the absence of any other powers to countervail it. But I guess with the 2021, the environment, the situation, and the regional dynamics will change, and Turkey will have to adjust itself to those.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you to all our panelists, Professor Özel as a keynote speaker, and Professors Varvelli and Hamzawy. Thanks for your interventions, because really in a few minutes, you were able to retrace 10 years of profound upheavals and to give also us some keys to understand the future. And I leave the floor to the next panel, to Professor Fondi as a chair. And thank you so much. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Federica, for giving the floor. Our panel, after two countries that experienced the Arab Spring, actually is supposed to deal with the situations which did not experience this Arab Spring, but where some ferments are present. We were supposed to deal with both Algeria and Morocco, but as you anticipated, unfortunately, our speaker for Morocco, Zineb Benalla, was not able at the last minute to join the panel. So I will introduce our surviving panelist, who is Ambassador Pasquale Ferrara, and he will focus mostly on Algeria. I understand also that Morocco would be dealt with in the following panel, at least part. So we'll have the occasion to speak about Morocco as well. Now, it's really a pleasure for me to introduce Ambassador Pasquale Ferrara. He's a very important and competent colleague in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think there is no other person more suitable than him today to speak about Algeria, because he was ambassador of Italy to Alger until a few weeks ago. So he's really fresh from this experience. He's a very senior diplomat with many experiences around the world, but I wanted to stress that he's also an academic, teaching diplomacy and negotiations. And also is an author of many books on international relations, democracy, and religion. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to him to describe the situation in Algeria. Please.
Thank you, Patrizio, for this very kind introduction. First of all, let me say that I feel a little bit scared because I was left alone in dealing with difficult issues. So I rely on your support and help. To start with, if you allow me, I would like to to say that I'm a little bit puzzled by using this metaphor of the seasons, spring, fall, winter, by the way, without ever mentioning the summer related to the Arab uprising since 2010. In general, I find that the narrative of the failure of the so-called Arab Spring is a little bit superficial. We read a lot about this failure in the media, above all. Why? Because the causes of the social malaise in the region are still there, are still present, and going back even to at least 20 years. If you read the United Nations UNDP Arab Human Development Reports, they have been consistently highlighting the sense of alienation, a lack of social empowerment in the region, including the insufficient level of human security. Don't forget this dimension. And then the cause of the supposed failure of the Arab Spring should be found not necessarily at national level or at the level of the internal governance. If you take the case of Libya and Syria, we are confronted there with the transnationalized civil wars, case of proxy wars, like in the case of Yemen, and geopolitical constraints, like the case of Iraq and Lebanon. So the Algerian events of 2019 must be seen in this wider context. I call this not the second wave, but it's a continuation of the Arab popular movement that started very early at the beginning of this decade. It is about political change, but above all, it has been already said about social change. And it's a process that is advancing very painfully and in a non-linear way. In Algeria, millions of people decided to take the street. I was told by officials that in a given day in Algeria, in the different cities, there were at least 18 million people protesting in a single Friday. And these people decide to protest in a very, let's say, peaceful way. Now, one of the future of the Algerian street is the choice of peaceful demonstration. And I must say that this in a way was also reciprocated by the security forces. There were no attacks, no repression of this demonstration in the public street. It has been already said that more than a demand of democracy, it has been, in the case of Algeria and other also countries, a matter of social justice, and I would say also accountability of ruling elites. As for the agenda, the claims of the Algerian street have been the following point. The first has been separation between the military from the civilian, of this military dimension from the civilian dimension. Even though, as you know, in Algeria, the army has a very high reputation because it is considered at the popular level a liberation army, and it is very well respected by the people. The second point, it has been already mentioned, fight against corruption, the kleptocrat oligarchs and the deep state. By the way, in 2019, it was started something that we Italians know very well, a process that was called clean hands, with a lot of trials and arrests of oligarchs close to the previous regime. The demand was also ending the dilapidation of national resources, especially oil and gas, but also the opposition to the exploitation of the shale gas in the south because of the environmental consequences. Demands for real jobs and employment opportunities. So it was not about, let's say, social welfare. It was about dignity as a social economic program. There was also the request of generational change, not only in the political institution camp, but also in the economic and social field. And then a real participatory political system, especially in favor of youth and women. Now, about the feature of this popular movement, we can identify the following elements. The absence, it has been said already, of pre-existing political organization before the beginning of this mass mobilization. And as a consequence of that, fragmentation and improvisation. That also led to the difficulty of expressing a unitary leadership. Now, one of the slogans of the street was, there is only one hero, the people. But when you have the people as an hero, the people is not able to negotiate in a unitary way with a counterpart. Let's say, not only the army, of course, but also the governance. And the other slogan of the street was dégage, get out, but without really proposing an alternative in terms of governing a very complicated country. And in general, there was a distrust of the process of representative democracy. So all in all, I would say, by using the words of Charles Tilly for revolution in Europe, this was a really revolutionary situation which did not produce a revolutionary outcome. You know, the concept and the practice of revolution is very rooted in the Algerian society since the War of Independence in 1962. But the movement of the 22 February 2019 looked more like a social liberation movement than a revolution. Why? Because after the national shock of the so-called Black Decade, la décennie noire in the 90s, with internal terrorism and the military and paramilitary reaction, the Algerian finally only in 2019 were able to reoccupy public places, both physically and metaphorically as the public sphere. The fall of Bouteflika was the direct consequence of the sort of hubris of the regime, challenging and potentially humiliating an entire nation with the prospect of a fifth mandate of a sixth president already unable to fulfill the fourth. Now, one popular joke that I particularly liked said, and it involved, because it involved Italy, an election without Bouteflika is like a World Cup without Italy. So it was so, people were so, let's say, fed up of the presence of the Ancien Regime that they took the street as a matter of reaction because they felt that their dignity was offended. So I would say that I'm a little bit more, let's say, optimistic about the results of this Iraq of the popular movement, because it brought about profound changes in the governance and induced a process of reform that is still in progress. We don't know how it will end. Whatever we think of these political dynamics, whether we can call it, we call it a transition or a mere adaptation of the ruling elite, the popular movement was not able to complete its own internal transition from streets to seats, exactly because there was a reject of the formal process of participation, of political participation. But this has heavily damaged the, in my opinion, the popular movement, that decided not to participate at all in the presidential election in December 2019. So in an effort of boycotting the election, an effort that of course failed, and now even more for being jeopardized by the restriction imposed by the consequence of the pandemic. So refusing to participate in the political process gave the, let's say, the high ground to the ruling elites, because they accused basically the street to ask for the designation of unelected wise men with an unclear task, while, and this is a peculiar reversal of role, the army was requesting a democratic election. So of course it was a cage where the popular movement was caught. More recently, and this is different in comparison with the Tunisian case, the recent constitutional reform did not happen through an ad hoc convention. In the case of Tunisia, was a National Constituent Assembly, but was the emanation of institutions and consultative bodies that, by the way, were not considered as representative enough by the popular movement, that at any rate rejected also this process of consultation. So where are we now? Now, even before the recent evolution of the Algerian political system, it was classified as an hybrid system. Somebody said it was sort of competitive authoritarianism. Now the elements of this hybridization increased even more. Significant changes occurred in the political institutional system after Bouteflika. However, they do not entirely reflect the much deeper changes that have taken place in society in terms of transformation of political culture. So the expression a more open society in a less closed political system seems to describe well the current state of affairs of the Algerian evolution. Now, to conclude, was the 2019 Iraq popular movement a missed opportunity? History will tell us, but for sure, in the near future, the popular movement will have to take some risk and engaging in the political process. Essentially, the next possible general political elections, solving in that way the contradiction that has been existing so far between, in the view of the popular movement, between peoplehood from one side and nationhood on the other side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Ferrara, for this very clear picture about the peculiarities of the Algeria situation. Actually, when you speak about the peaceful demonstration and also the lack of repression on the side of security forces, it reminds me also about another country who experienced a kind of same attitude, which is Jordan. Actually, when I had the chance to be there as ambassador of Italy, it happened even that the police was distributing water to the people manifesting in the streets. So the atmosphere was very similar, I think, at least at the beginning. So now I can say that if we consider Algeria as a situation which is evolving in a kind of peaceful way toward a change, toward an evolution, also the two monarchies like Morocco and Jordan, I think, are on the same path, in the sense that the monarchy managed with some reforms, with some change to meet some requests of the people. And also I think they were facilitated by the fact that a religious factor played in those cases, because both the king of Jordan and the king of Morocco, they are descendant from the prophet. So maybe also there is a certain restraint by people to attack such a, let's say, holy figure. Having said that, I wanted also to ask you one question, specific question. Do you think that, I mean, the opinion of some analysts that saying that the Algerian authorities managed to control the situation also thanks to the fact that they used the huge reserve, financial reserve of the country in order to give subsidies and to, let's say, please some part of the population, but that now, because of the crisis of the post-COVID situation and also the crisis of the oil prices and so on, they will be in a position a bit weaker in order to use this tool. First question. The second question is, do you think that at the end, the Iraq movement could express some personalities who could be, to some extent, co-opted in the power? This transition could see the insertion of some people from the base, from the movement in the ruling class?
Okay, for the first question, I think that make no mistake. So the street, the Algerian street, asked for a refundation of the policy of the polity as a precondition. But basically, they decide to talk about economic reform at a later stage. And the second, because they said, for the time being, our first task is to change the governance. And then we will deal with the structural reform in economic terms in the country. But second, I have been talking to many of the protagonists, of the actors, let's say, of the popular movement. They do not believe in liberalization of the economy. They do not believe at all in globalization. They are very much content with the social welfare that is provided by the authorities now. Of course, it is a matter of combating and fighting corruption, but not changing the system. I give you an example. At the very eve of the presidential election, the parliament, which is, by the way, not very representative, but the parliament decided to pass a new law on the hydrocarbons, allowing foreign companies to invest in a more, let's say, flexible way in this very strategic sector for Algeria. And there was a huge protest organized by the movement, by the Iraq movement, against the liberalization of this field. Many representatives of the street are against free trade with European Union, for instance, because they say we are a social system and we have to keep this fundamental of our economy. Now, the real question, how you do finance this kind of, let's say, generous social welfare. And I think that, personally, I do not think in the idea that sooner or later Algeria would know some form of bankruptcy, because at the end of the day, we were talking about technocracy. There are clever people managing relevant sectors of the Algerian economy. Of course, they decide not to ask for international loans, especially not to ask the intervention of the International Monetary Fund and so on. But at the same time, there was an opening towards foreign investments with a change of the law governing foreign investment. Now the rule 4951 that was in place before had been basically abolished, except in the strategic sector like energy, of course, and defense. So I think that this should be, let's say, understood in a more nuanced way. The second question, I don't know if there will be the the capacity of the social movement to express a single leadership. I left Algeria just a few weeks ago, and I saw a process of convergence of the different strands of the popular movement towards a single platform, because the problem is not expressing one leader. The real issue is to form a unified political platform. And then on the basis of this political platform, you can appoint a representative, a leader, somebody that is empowered to negotiate with the power.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ferrara. I hope you can remain with us for the rest of the meeting. And I give the floor back to Federica Zoja to introduce maybe the third panel. And thank you again.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Patrizio. And I leave the floor to Jonathan, Laurence, Professor. I give you the floor to introduce our roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day to all, and welcome to today's roundtable, which is entitled, "Did Everything Change So Nothing Would Change?" My name is Jonathan Laurence, and I am one of the directors at Reset Dialogues, and it is a true pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues here on the first of 2 stimulating days of meetings, organized, I should add, very professionally by Federica Zoja. The reference contained in the panel's title, in our roundtable's title, "Did Everything Change So Nothing Would Change?" of course, is to the classic novel, The Leopard, Il Gatto Pardo, a novel that captured a crucial moment of Italian democratization in the mid-19th century. Now, the Italian unification or Risorgimento of 1860 was itself the second attempt after 1848. And Italian patriots first needed to vanquish a theocratic threat to national unity and to democratization, which was, of course, the figure of the Catholic Church right around the time of the First Vatican Council. Now, it took decades to normalize political participation of observant Catholics in Italian electoral institutions. It took another 60 years before the Church and Italy recognized one another. It took a full century from 1848 nearly to get to a republic. So during that century, of course, there were moments of state violence, of anarchist assassinations, and much else that made contemporary observers very pessimistic about the chances for democracy to ever emerge. And I should add that for external reasons of geopolitics, even well into the 20th century Italian Republic, a full third of the Italian electorate was essentially unrepresented in the national government because of the Cold War. Now, many other nations can tell a similar story, not just in Europe, but around the globe, of stops and starts, of 2 steps forward, of 3 steps back. So what can we make of the past decade then in North Africa? What still needs to change, so to speak, so things cannot stay the same, but rather improve? Well, we witnessed the February 11th movement and what became of it in Morocco, a constitutional referendum that did not manage to steer the Mahzen, the royal court, past all of the very real challenges that it still faces, including regional revolt. We have seen the Iraq movement, which was just given an excellent exposition by Ambassador Ferrara, the Iraq movement and how it has been channeled back into state institutions. So what about Tunisia, the regional exception, the birthplace of the latest wave of hope for reform? Where do these countries and the others find themselves in this stubbornly non-linear timeline of democratization and state centralization? Well, we have convened here today 3 international experts, each of whom has tremendous knowledge and experience and a prodigious publication record in the region. I will introduce all of them right now, and then in between we'll just pass from one to the next. So first up, we will have Lisa Anderson, who is president of the board at Reset Dialogues US, but who was dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, as well as the Shotwell Professor of International Relations. She also served as the chair of the Political Science Department there and as director of the Middle East Institute. Professor Anderson is a past president of the Middle East Studies Association and a past chair of the board of the Social Science Research Council. She has served on the boards of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and Human Rights Watch, where she served as co-chair of Human Rights Watch Middle East, and also as a member of the International Advisory Council of the World Congress for Middle East Studies. And of course, she served as president of the American University of Cairo. Anderson is the author of Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power. She is also the author of The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya from 1820 to 1980, which I recommend highly for those seeking to understand the region today. She also is, by the way, a book reviewer for the Middle East and North Africa for Foreign Affairs. So you can read her frequently there, or also on the website of the Institut Montaigne in France, or of course, right on our website, ResetDOC. Next to speak after Professor Anderson, we are very, very lucky to have Ursula Lindsey, whom we have been trying to invite as a speaker for a long time, and I'm so glad it finally worked. Ursula Lindsey writes about culture and politics in North Africa and the Middle East. She lived in Cairo for over a decade and got her start at the independent magazine Cairo Times. She was the culture editor of Cairo magazine, and she also served as a special projects editor at the independent news site Mada Masr. And she reported from Egypt for many years for the BBC PRI radio program, which is one of my local NPR stations, The World, and covered the Arab Spring for a number of publications, including Newsweek, the New York Times, the New Yorker Online, and the blog of the London Review of Books. She has also been the Middle East correspondent for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she lived in Rabat for several years. Today, she's living in Amman and contributing to The Point, to The Nation, and to the New York Review of Books. She hosts an excellent podcast called Bulak about contemporary writing about the Middle East and North Africa. Finally, the last to speak on our roundtable is Stefano Torelli, who is a researcher at the European Asylum Support Office, which is the EU agency that deals with asylum and refugees, whose headquarters in Malta. Stefano Torelli is a political analyst and expert on the Middle East and North Africa. And he was a consultant who worked with several international think tanks as a fellow and a researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations, at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and at the University of Ulm in Milan. He has also written several books and articles on the Middle East and North Africa. His articles have appeared in the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies and several other venues, and he earned his PhD from La Sapienza. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry for the lengthy introduction, but I wanted to make sure you know how lucky we are to have these three speakers. And so please, I hand the floor over to Lisa Anderson.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for including me in this conversation. It's already been quite meaty, and I look forward to the remarks of my fellow roundtablers. Naturally, we all have more to say than we have time to say it, and so I'm going to launch into most of my prepared remarks, but I may skip some because the stories that we've already heard are the stories of what's happened in the last decade. But it is true that 10 years ago, a small town Tunisian street vendor set himself ablaze in frustration at official neglect and indifference, sparking the biggest and most consequential uprisings in the Arab world in 75 years at least. Rulers in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya were turned out of office. Bahrain and Syria's regimes barely clung to power, while other governments throughout the region anxiously responded to popular unrest with generous packages of economic, social benefits and stepped up domestic repression. Nonetheless, in the subsequent years, the turmoil continued to roil the region. Civil wars have racked Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and millions of people have been forced from their homes. I think it's important that we Remember the fact that the conflict in Syria alone has displaced over half the country's population. Soon, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, even war-racked Yemen and Libya, were to house the world's largest populations of displaced persons and forced migrants. Turkey was the largest host country in the world with nearly 4 million refugees, mainly Syrians. But two other countries with Syrian borders, Jordan and Lebanon, also feature among the top 10. And Pakistan and Iran are also among the top 10 refugee hosting countries as the principal hosts of migrants from Afghanistan, the second largest producer of refugees. By the middle of the decade, Europe's concern that such refugees would spill into the heart of the continent fed nativist populist movements from the UK to Hungary. Among the consequences of the Arab uprisings has been the exposure of Europe's deep ambivalence about its ostensibly liberal values. Indeed, perhaps one of the most powerful legacies of the uprisings of 2011 is the revelation of the depth of the hypocrisy and cynicism of much of the democracy promotion of the countries that counted themselves among the victors of the Cold War. To take just the United States, let me remind you that the Bush administration's rationales for its invasion of Iraq in 2003 were varied, but almost always included a commitment to a vision in which, to quote Bush himself, governments respond to the will of the people. Liberty, he assured us, is the design of nature. Liberty is the direction of history. Then Obama, his successor, speaking in Cairo in 2009, echoed this view, proclaiming his, quote, unyielding belief that all people yearn for certain things, the ability to speak your mind and have a say in how you're governed. Confidence in the rule of law and the equal administration of justice, government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people, the freedom to live as you choose. These are not just American ideals, they are human rights, and that is why we will support them everywhere. Confronted with the opportunity to actually put those sentiments into action during the uprisings, however, the United States and its European allies were immobilized, speaking of things that were frozen, by interests in stability and security and economic access, and virtually everywhere they failed to honor the values they had so strenuously advocated. Small wonder that the election of Donald Trump was welcomed across the region. A transactional deal maker with no patience for moralizing, he seemed, perhaps oddly to his American detractors, to be straightforward and clear-eyed. The peoples of the Middle East and North Africa, who had protested government corruption and incompetence, could expect no succor for it from the US or its allies. They were on their own, as they actually had been all along. Now it was simply undisguised by empty pieties. Amazingly, the people of the region nonetheless took dangerous political stances, even knowing they would get little external support. We've heard already Sudan and Algeria, which had been calm in the early years of the decade, saw popular protests that brought down rulers later, and Morocco confronted serious political unrest. Most recently, Iraq and Lebanon witnessed cross-sectarian protests against corrupt and incompetent governing classes. It often looks from afar like a cold, hard winter has congealed the hopes of the Arab Spring. But that does not fully tell the story. The Trump administration has reshaped the American posture in the region in ways that will present new challenges and perhaps opportunities for the Biden administration, as much by acknowledging truths as by changing policies. Despite his promises, US troops are still entangled in quagmire-like conflicts from Afghanistan and Iraq to Syria and Somalia. But Trump's recent recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in the Western Sahara ends the coy pretense of even-handedness in that dispute. And so too his move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, the US Embassy to Israel to Jerusalem, also made public what previous administrations had pretended to deny, that the US was Israel's advocate, not an honest broker. Trump's publication of the obituary of the two-state solution in the Israel-Palestine conflict merely broadcast what had been widely known. It was dead. This was a demise made possible by the weakness of what used to be called the Steadfastness Front and the newfound confidence of Gulf rulers who had managed to escape substantial domestic upheaval. But the strength of an arrangement based on tactical agreement over Iran as a common enemy and shared authoritarian disdain for popular sentiment is unlikely to satisfy populations still aspiring to the demands of the 2011 uprisings: bread, freedom, and social justice. The balance sheet of the uprisings in the Arab world a decade on is difficult to calculate. Obviously, the debit side is long. The loss of life and livelihoods across the region is hard to weigh. In Lebanon alone, the economic tailspin threatens several of the best universities in the region. In Libya, a war economy has become so deeply rooted that it's hard to imagine its replacement with genuine peaceful prosperity. In Egypt, Trump's favorite dictator borrows from a playbook written in the Gulf, pursuing reform that obscures deepening domestic repression and cronyism. And I have not even mentioned the humanitarian toll of the conflict in Iraq, Syria, or Yemen. Yet perhaps there's something to be calculated on the credit side of the ledger. This is what I want to emphasize. The struggle to remake the Middle East is not over. And more it is clearly a struggle waged not by outside powers, but in the region itself. This is not always good or pretty. The mischievous role of regional powers in prolonging and exacerbating conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Libya is obvious and has already been remarked today. These so-called proxy wars are damaging to patron and client alike. But they are increasingly battles within the region. The inability of the world's great powers to exercise the authority once associated with that designation is apparent for all to see. The incompetent and bumbling responses of erstwhile industrial powers to the pandemic merely confirm what the Arab Spring had laid bare. Both the regimes that depend on the great powers and the people who are cowed by them are sorely mistaken. The pandemic, as a recent UN report puts it, has magnified many decades-long challenges, including violence and conflict. Inequalities, unemployment, poverty, inadequate, I'm quoting them, inadequate social safety nets, human rights concerns, insufficiently responsive institutions, and so forth. But these problems are not made by the pandemic and will not be solved when the pandemic subsides. What will be left is governments whose failures are manifest and whose peoples are learning with each passing trial how to take things into their own hand. The recent UN report titled The Impact of COVID-19 on the Arab Region is subtitled An Opportunity to Build Back Better. In some ways, this sounds like delusional wishful thinking. The pandemic will be responsible for a substantial contraction in the regional economy. A quarter of the population that's not already there will fall into poverty. Millions and millions of jobs will be lost when millions of adults are already unemployed. And the heightened risks for the 55 million people in need of humanitarian assistance will be dramatic. But why not credit the efforts of the young revolutionaries, those who gave everything to call attention to neglect, corrupt, incompetent government a decade ago? On this front, I beg to differ with Soli Özel's wish that the West would support them. I don't think that they will. And moreover, I think there is a growing appreciation of the value of self-reliance. European inaction in Libya is a case in point. And though I would decry regional interference, I think it is a salutary piece of regionalization and localization of problem solving. At least it's going in that direction. And I would like to echo Amr Hamzawy's sense that some local governments, such as Egypt's, are increasingly responsive to domestic demands, not obviously for political rights as such, but for technocratically competent governance. These conflicts are not frozen, at least not on the local level. There is movement among both governments and local advocates of change. Yes, I agree. I think Ambassador Ferrara is, as he put it, this is a continuation of the movements of 2011. Building back better may actually be possible, but only thanks to groundwork laid in the Arab Spring. Bread, freedom, and social justice are still powerful aspirations. And without the expectation that international patrons will help serve them up, the peoples of the region might just produce them themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa Anderson. I will now give the floor to Ursula Lindsey.
Hello, it's nice to be here with all of you. Buonasera, vorrei parlare in italiano, ma non lo farò perché non è al livello che vorrei. I grew up in Italy, but I'm going to speak in English because I don't work in Italian. But it's nice to be involved in an event like this that's set there. And I'm going to talk about Morocco, partly because I think you have so many excellent speakers like Lisa Anderson, who already can speak about Egypt and Tunisia and Libya better than I can, although I lived the longest in Egypt of all the countries we've been discussing. I lived 5 years in Morocco and visited quite a bit before and have continued writing about it since. And I'm going to give a little bit of background and then go into quite a detailed description of some of the things that are happening there right now. So it won't be as much of a big picture analysis as a lot of the other speakers have given, but hopefully some of these cases will illuminate some bigger trends. So as it's been mentioned, Morocco belongs in the group of countries that are sort of seen to have managed their way through the Arab Spring successfully, if the definition of success is to have not had any regime change and avoided the kind of rupture that was seen in other places through a very quick response by the monarchy and a referendum that promised political reforms and the opening of political competition to the leading Islamist party in the country, which happened soon thereafter and allowed them to be in government after that. Unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone is also aware, like the promised political reforms have not materialized to the degree that was hoped for by protesters. And it's worth mentioning in this conversation about things changing to stay the same, that already in 2011 in Morocco, came after a previous cycle of expectation at the arrival of the new king in 1999, who was seen as a reformer and someone who would be the king of the poor and change also socioeconomic inequality. And by 2011, there had already been a disappointment after the initial big hopes of the beginning of that era. So since then, since 2011, as I said, there were these elections that allowed the PJD, the Party of Justice and Development, to come into government, where its influence, though, has been pretty significantly curtailed by the ongoing really fundamental powers of the monarchy and the security establishment. And the regional context shifting the way it did also made this Islamist party quite cautious to assert itself as they saw what happens in neighboring countries. So they, are the prime minister is from the party now, and they are in government, but they're certainly not calling the shots on most important decisions or strategic decisions for the country. And as has also been mentioned, Morocco had probably its most significant protest movement, something that was also called the ResetDOC, that was regionally based and was a protest movement that broke out in 2016 in the Rif region of northern Morocco, when a young man who was having a dispute with a public official over something that had to do with his livelihood, he was a fishmonger, was accidentally killed in a trash compactor where his catch had been thrown out by an inspector at the port. Once again, like a highly symbolic and sort of disturbing death. And this triggered protests that were against corruption, against also historical grievances in that part of the country, but very, very big protests in that area, which were tolerated for a few months, and then the area was sealed down, and eventually the protests were completely repressed, and many of the participants were put on trial and sentenced to multi-year sentences in jail on charges of destabilizing national security and terrorism and so on. But that remains a very touchy subject. And so a lot of the people who've gotten in trouble since, it has been for their coverage of that movement or their sympathy for that movement or their continuing to talk about it. And the people who have been getting targeted in recent years, and what I would argue is a continued escalation. So the interesting thing about Morocco is that it hasn't been threatened, like I said, with even demands for like that fundamental of change, and yet it has followed the regional trends of increasing repression against media and artists and activists in recent years. And I'll just talk about a few of the cases because I think they sort of illustrate the way that this is working right now, and say some things also about what we can expect. So a lot of the cases that I've followed, also because they've been very high profile, have to do with journalists. The independent press in Morocco has been very seriously undermined and curtailed through advertising boycotts and litigation. One of the most prominent cases is the newspaper Akhbar al-Yom, which faced multiple trials. And then 2 years ago, its publisher, Tawfiq Bouachirine, was very spectacularly put on trial after a raid on his offices. And the charges, instead of being political, were charges of sexual assault and trafficking on the basis of videos found in his office, which he says the police put in there. He said he was spied on, and they say he filmed himself. So even the provenance of these videos, which have not been publicly shared, is unclear. And so he had this trial where female witnesses were called, and one of the problematic aspects of the trial is that a number of the witnesses did not wish to appear, did not wish to testify against him. Some of them had to be dragged to court, some of them hid, and one in particular has gone public with saying that she's in exile now. Afef Bernani was saying that she was forced to testify against him. There was no basis to the accusations. She has, in fact, was then countersued for her remarks by the police because she said they'd falsified her statement, and she was convicted to 6 months in prison for for saying something slanderous about the police. So that was the first case with this newspaper. And then the second was a young woman, a female reporter there called Hajar Raisouni. She was arrested leaving her OBGYN's office, her fiance, her doctor, and the people who work there, and charged with having an illegal abortion. This case also, there was a huge outcry, and after she was convicted, she was pardoned, and she now lives in exile. She's always denied that she said she had a medical emergency, but abortion is illegal in Morocco, as are all sexual relations outside of marriage. Her uncle, who went on to become the editor of the newspaper, is now also been arrested and is under investigation, again on a charge of sexual assault. The journalist Omar Radi is also currently under investigation. He is a journalist who specializes in investigations into political corruption. One of the projects he was working on was about the ways in which the state expropriates collectively held tribal land. He, like other dissidents in Morocco recently, participated in an investigation with Amnesty International that determined that his phone had been hacked using Israeli spyware. Shortly after the results of this investigation were published, which were denied, and also implying that not implying, stating that the Moroccan authorities are the only ones who could have carried this out. 3 days later, he was himself accused of being a spy, of receiving funds from and acting as on behalf of foreign entities on the basis of contacts he's had with some foreign diplomats, of meetings he's had with them. And an award he was given by an investigative journalism fund in Europe, in Switzerland, to carry out his work was considered the foreign funding for his for work to tarnish the image of the state. And then he was also accused of fiscal evasion. He was, after an altercation with another journalist, accused of public drunkenness, and then he was accused again of sexual assault. So this is the third journalist from that newspaper to be accused of rape. And there's been a lot of organizations that have questioned these charges, not because anyone believes that accusations such as these shouldn't be investigated very seriously, because it's very hard, though, generally speaking, to report and prosecute sexual assault in Morocco. It remains very rare. And it is a startling coincidence that these cases continue to be brought against independent journalists at one of the publications that is clearly not well liked by the authorities. So this has been a huge issue in Morocco, how to address this, how to balance concerns with fighting sexual violence versus concerns with freedom of expression. These are the journalists, and then there have been other figures such as Mati Bunjeb, an academic, again involved in investigative journalism and an NGO, who has been on trial since 2015 in a trial that just drags on and on and on, and was recently charged with new charges of money laundering. There's a number of things one can say about some of these charges. One is that they are almost never political. Morocco did away with prison sentences for journalists not that long ago. And so journalists can't be prosecuted on the basis of their work, but they simply are prosecuted increasingly on criminal charges of various kinds. And as you see, increasingly on issues of on sexual crimes and morality crimes. The other thing is that the people who are being targeted, or the publications who are being targeted, often are ones that have investigated political, economic issues and corruption, who covered the Hirak movement in the Rif, or who are being critical of the king personally has always been a red line in Morocco, but who are critical perhaps also of other prominent officials or of the Ministry of Interior and its officials. And the charges that are brought against them are charges that, like I said, are generally very uncommon, or of which only is, while the practices are not uncommon, the prosecution of them is very low. So both in the case of abortion, which is known to be a practice that takes place widely, there's an extremely low number of prosecutions for abortion. And unfortunately, also in the case of sexual assault, there's a very low number of actual prosecutions for it. So generally speaking, there is not a good record of prosecuting these crimes, and yet they come up again and again with dissidents. And the other thing that is worth noting is that in all of these cases, there is now an ecosystem of news sites, which are the top news sites in the country, all of which have close connections to members of the royal establishment or to former government officials, and all of whom also have close connections to police sources, because they often know about the accusations ahead of time. They are often on the scene when the people are arrested. Hajar Raisuni, there were cameras there when they arrested this woman in front of her OBGYNs, and similarly for a lot of the other journalists. Because often the publications threaten them with arrest more or less explicitly before the charges have even been brought. And this is being increasingly referred to as the slander media, médias de diffamation, I think in Arabic it's tashhir. And there was a letter by 100 Moroccan journalists recently calling for the authorities to rein this media in, whose purpose seems to be to run these smear campaigns against government critics and to amplify accusations against them and to threaten people who haven't had charges brought against them yet with the possibility of some form of exposure of their personal life, of financial details, of intimate details. And then the other thing is that clearly the basis for all of this is very widespread surveillance, both of people's publicly available social media but also of all their digital communications in one way or another. And I think this kind of coordinated attack on people who are viewed as problematic, I mean, the media plus the legal charges basically has an effect of isolating the person and has this reputational effect. The goal is to ruin a person's reputation and to really actually and to leave them isolated if they're not abandoned by friends and family. Friends and family are often sucked into these campaigns and are themselves targeted with interrogations and with articles talking about them. There's a kind of weaponization of social stigma and social shame that's very successful in making people, very afraid of being exposed, especially when there's a huge discrepancy between what's legally allowed and what's actually practiced in all sorts of aspects of one's life. And so many people are vulnerable to exposure. I find this interesting. I think this is something to think about. Obviously, there's things about what's happening in Morocco now that are very familiar, down to things like from Egypt, from Tunisia, and down to things like the fact that the most popular and incredibly pervasive soccer team chant of the last couple of years was an incredibly political song, in my country they wrong me. And that one of the most listened to rap songs, which got the rapper imprisoned, was a song, Shab, Long Live the People, which was seen as offensive because it's Long Live the King. And then for the content of the song as well, which was very explicit in its criticism. So there's a huge amount of social dissatisfaction and anger, which has only been exacerbated by the very difficult economic conditions of the last year. And at the same time, there is a really almost zero tolerance approach to dissent and criticism, and some methods of surveillance and of personal attack that are very reminiscent actually of the Tunisia under Benalla, frankly, from stories I've been told by Tunisian dissidents at that time, of being targeted and isolated in this way. And at the same time, I would say, I think these are sort of very dark, stories that they raise issues that I think are not going to be going away, and especially for young people, of privacy, of personal autonomy and personal freedom in their personal lives, also of freedom of expression, of not being told to shut up and behave by elders who they know themselves are not doing so. So they also, I think there's some things to think about here in these cases that lead back to a bigger picture. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was very powerful, and I should add that Reset Dialogues had for 2 years in a row held the Casablanca Dialogues and the Casablanca seminars. And we found that it was actually difficult to continue our partnerships because of misgivings and I think genuine worry and fear on the part of authorities of whom they were offending with such liberal programming. And so what you describe, I think, resonates, unfortunately, throughout the system and even within Morocco's international cooperation, which otherwise has been occasionally quite good. I now turn to Stefano Torelli. We are running somewhat late, I apologize, who will give the final presentation of our final roundtable of the day. And we'll just have time probably for a few minutes of discussion, but I do hope you can stick around. I apologize that, that we are off schedule, but I now hand the floor to Dr. Torelli.
Thank you all. So no worries for the, let's say, the fact that we are running a little bit late, I will say, because it's so interesting. So I think that, okay, it's not a problem at all. Maybe the problem is that I have to speak after such panelists, so I feel a little bit embarrassed for this. No, but joke apart. Listen, what I was thinking about when I was thinking about how to structure, let's say, this this speech and what to talk about, I kept reflecting on the fact that the question was, did everything changed so that nothing changes? That's a good question, of course. And if you take a picture of what North Africa and Middle East region is nowadays, yes, maybe there is this kind of temptation to say that actually a lot of things changed, but at the end of the day, nothing really changed. From my point of view, I think that, yeah, this could be true from one point of view, but from the other point of view, we experienced and we witnessed a lot of changes during these last 10 years that I think we would never have imagined a change like this. So I will try to explain myself. So I think that from 2010, 2011 onwards, of course, we had a lot of dramatic changes all over, especially North Africa, and then, of course, Middle East. And I think that there was a time in 2011, 2012, maybe up to the beginning of 2013, when actually, I think that we were witnessing and we were experiencing an occasion, and all the area was experiencing a dramatic occasion for change. And actually, this happened to a certain extent, because if you look at what happened in Tunisia, for example, if you look at what is Tunisia, nowadays, after 10 years, we cannot deny that a dramatic change occurred, and then something really, we cannot say that everything is, like it was before, because actually something changed. So if you look at Tunisia, we have the impression that we had a sort of change. If you look at what happened in Egypt, in Libya, and then in Yemen, in Syria, how can we state that nothing changed? So of course, a lot of things changes, and of course, the region and the balance of powers within the region changed dramatically. The fact is, what this change was and is about. That's the point, because I think that you know, there were a lot of changes, as I've said, but I think that we had a lot of changes in a so-called macro level. So we now have, as I was mentioning before, a balance of power, for example, within the region, so within the Middle Eastern and North Africa region, which is completely different from the balance of power that we had in 2010. We have local actors such as Egypt, for example, that from a point of view of its regional influence, its regional expansion, I would say, took advantage of what happened and tried, and now is trying to play a role that, you know, Egypt wasn't playing this role since at least 20 or 30 years. From the other point of view, we have an actor like Turkey, which, if you remember, until 2010 was, you know, presented in the Western clubs, I will say, as a sort of new model. No, I remember in 2008, 2009, 2010, when a lot of governments, civil society actors, people in Western countries talked about Turkey as, you know, the broker actor that could have had the possibility to really change all the dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa, all the relationships between Middle East and North Africa and Europe, and bringing in the Western countries a lot of Arab countries. You know, so at the time, Turkey was playing a really, you know, influential and important role in terms of relationship between Middle East and Europe, for example, in terms of building a bridge, we used to say, between Middle East and Europe. Now, 10 years on, the picture that we have is completely changed. Now we have, for example, an actor like Turkey, which is completely, you know, hit its position vis-a-vis the Western countries, the European countries, has dramatically changed. We are experiencing a country, Turkey, that is slowly coming back to that sort of authoritarianism that it had not experienced since 20 years, I will say. We have new actors like, as I said before, Egypt, that is trying to again play its role and influence the region like it never did before in the past 20 years. We have an unexperienced, you know, split between the Sunni world, no? So if you think about it, until 10 years ago, the narrative, when we talked about Middle Eastern internal balance of power, we were always told about this big divide existing between Shia and Sunni communities, and so between Iran and its allies and Saudi Arabia and its allies. And now we are experiencing a total new thing, which is, you know, the split between the Saudi world itself. So we are seeing how Saudi Arabia and Egypt on one hand, and Qatar and Turkey on the other hand, are basically fighting themselves, no? Why? Because they have different position, of course, when it comes to political Islam, to geopolitical assets in Libya and in other parts of the Middle East, and so on. So we cannot really say that nothing changed. A lot of things changed from the point of view of the internal relations that we have among actors in the Middle East. What actually did not change, or did not change to such an extent to really change something, it's the the dynamics, the internal dynamics that move these countries. So and that's, in my point of view, this is very sad, because I think that really this region had an opportunity, had an occasion to change, but in the end we are not seeing this change. So in Egypt we had a sort of yes, democratization process at the beginning, but after less than 2 years we have witnessed this sort of coup d'etat from the army, and the army came back to power in a way that is more authoritarian than it was before. In Turkey, we have this trend too, and so we are seeing a country that slowly is going towards a very authoritarian system, a very close system, whereas 10 years ago we were dreaming about a new country, a new Turkey, which would have entering the European Union and finally solving all the problems that we have in our relations with the Middle East. We now have at least 3 conflicts, which, and you have mentioned this before, are presented like sort of civil conflicts, but in fact they are regional, if not international conflicts in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. And whoever imagined that back in 2010, that Syria, for example, would have become such a divided country. I lived in Syria for 2 years, and I never imagined this. So we have a lot of changes. It's not true that nothing changed. What really didn't change, I think, and again, this is a little bit sad, I will say, is the way these countries work internally. What did not change is the fact that even in a country like Tunisia, which is, the country that is depicted as the most democratic country now in North Africa, the country that has made a lot of step forwards and step towards a real democracy and so on. Even in a country like Tunisia, who can actually say that we are experiencing a new phase, a new era made up of new dynamics in terms of political changes, economic, social changes. So that's the point. That's the point. And I think that we have to think about it, because in the end of the day, this is one of the main problems that I think continue existing in the area, which is the fact that even in cases, as I was mentioning, like Tunisia, when things seem to be a little bit better, let's say, than other contexts, of course, better than Syria, Libya, Yemen, Egypt, needless to say, even in a country like Tunisia, we have the same old problems that we had up to 10 years ago. And these problems are related to a political class, basically, that is reluctant to actually change and give the floor to the young politicians and activists that could take it. a level of, a set of structural, social and economic problems that have not been solved, all dynamics, so that's the point. I always say that, for example, in Tunisia, it's true that we have witnessed dramatic changes since 2010 to up to now. But what I always say is that, in Tunisia, we have seen the fact that they have been able to build a brand new box, which they call democracy. But inside this box, up to now, for the moment, they didn't put anything. So that's the problem. This box is empty. We don't have real policies. We don't have a real interest in solving the actual and real socioeconomic problems that people is experiencing. And the result of this is very, very dangerous in my point of view, because if you have a situation like that, it means that if you are a Tunisian and you experience this so-called revolution and you put a lot of hope in this revolution, and now you are disillusioned because you keep seeing that internal dynamics does not change, are not changing, then it means that you don't have any other option. That's the point. That's the very dangerous point in my point of view. Why does Tunisia have the highest number of radicalized people, of foreign fighters that went to Iraq and Syria to fight along with ISIS and so on, and why this didn't happen in other countries, and why right in Tunisia, and Tunisia was, a sort of example of secularism in the region. I think that the answer lies here. The answer lies in the fact that they have already experienced a sort of change, and within this change, Tunisians are starting to realize that actually nothing is changing, and this is the most dangerous aspect that I have seen myself. If you go to Tunisia, for example, and I think that maybe some of you, if not all of you, have been there in the last years, you can feel, you can breathe this illusion. You can feel that people is more and more depressed, let's say, and that's the real danger that we have. So why did this happen? Because of course it's not easy to come to a conclusion of a sort of revolution within 5 or 10 years. We need more time, of course, but in the meantime, things in the region are changing. So it's not true that nothing is changing. Things are changing. And the most dangerous thing is that the new authoritarian actors, like, as I mentioned, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey from one point of view, and so on, they are taking advantage of this situation. So this is why I think that there is a high risk that we are losing an occasion, and we are, it's possible that we will continue to see this kind of dynamics in the region between the countries, and in the meanwhile, within every single country, really nothing will change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torelli, and thanks to all three panelists for their insights. We are going to take just 10 minutes for discussion, if you will allow it. I apologize again that we're not on schedule, but I do want to give the opportunity to some folks to ask each other questions, and I believe that Pasquale Ferrara had a question or a remark that he wanted to pose.
So it's not a question, rather, but a little comment that I would expect some reaction from the panelists. because once upon a time there was this beautiful theory in social science, the theory of political development, which is basically a box including different things, change in political system, change in the political culture, change in governance, change in demography and the social structure. So when we talk about change, I think maybe we should qualify what we mean by change. The second element, my impression that sometimes we do not talk about a change in contextual terms. Before I mentioned the fact that there were situations where the international, let's say, influence in internal evolution of the different countries was very powerful. What we have experienced, in my opinion, last year in 2019 is the fact that the streets rejected also this kind of influence. If you take the case of Lebanon, for instance, they want to get rid of Iranian influence, of the Saudi Arabian influence. They wanted just to, let's say, regain control of their own country. And thirdly, I think that the case of Tunisia, I have the impression sometimes that we talk about this successful, let's say, example more as a projection of our expectation on what should happen in a real world of democratization, rather than taking into account what's really the reality. I do not deny that Tunisia is a successful story for many aspects, but also complicated from a different point of view. And so I would expect from the Western point of view, let's say, that there would be much less judgment, as much more engagement. So we have to engage with this society, even with the governance of this country, in order to foster change, to facilitate, to encourage. And this is not an easy task, but I think it's the only policy that we can choose as an alternative to the narrative of democracy export. Of course, that didn't work, and it should not be even mentioned when we talk about the change in the region.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. I would like to give 2 minutes to each of the panelists to conclude, and I'm going to go in the same order that we went. So I turn first to Lisa Anderson for any observations or comments in response.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for having missed the beginning of Stefano's remarks because I was called away to the phone. But let me respond a little bit to Ambassador Ferrara's observations. And I'll start at the end. I actually think the problem is, what do you mean by engagement? And I think the challenge that everyone from outside the region has had for the last 100 years, 200 years, depending on when you want to start, the engagement of the Europeans and then Americans with the region is this profound ambivalence between wanting to see things we want to see, your sort of projection of what, so we want to see democracy, we want to see peace, we want to see, you know, goodness and light and so forth and so on. On the other hand, we want to see it because we want to see it, not because it, so the fundamental issue, and this is why I think democracy is not that useful a term in this context, is really accountability. And to whom do you want the governments to be accountable? And we say we want the governments to be accountable to the people, but in practice, we want them to be accountable to us because we're the ones that are providing the, you know, funding, we're the ones that, you know, and so forth and so on. That's impossible. That's just no government can be instructed to be accountable to its own people. It has to be accountable, in which case it's going to confront external patrons who are unhappy with the fact that they're more accountable to someone else. So I just think the temptation to want to be helpful which I think is, at least in the humanitarian side of things, quite genuine, has proven to be a sort of fool's errand here on the part of both the helpers and the helped. And one of the things that I sort of like, and at least I'm trying to find points of optimism or to be optimistic, is that I think there really is an increasing conviction on the part of the participants in some of these movements in Iraq and in Lebanon and in Algeria, for that matter, that nobody's going to help you. You're going to have to do this yourself, which means you are, in fact, going to have to get better organized, and that simply pouring into the streets and assuming that then everything also will be sweetness and light isn't going to work. But insofar as these movements do turn out to be somewhat sustainable, somewhat better organized over the course of time and so forth and so on, somewhat more self-reliant, then 2011 and the subsequent years will have been fruitful. If not, we are going to have a lot of wishful thinking on the part of everyone involved.
Thank you very much for that. I now turn to Ursula Lindsey.
Yeah, I have to say my experience as a reporter in the region for the last 15 years makes me very skeptical of what Western intervention can accomplish, and you know, if it's and of how well intentioned it ever is, how sincere and constructive. It has been so I mean, I arrived in Cairo the year the U.S. invaded Iraq, so you know, it's been so terribly destructive in some ways, and so there's also a paranoia that is not only paranoia in the region about foreign intervention, right? And one of the arguments against the Arab Spring has been like, look how these countries get torn apart, you know, and whether you know, of course, with conspiracy theories about how it's intentional and on the part of, you know, every element you can imagine, all allied together, but based on an underlying truth, which is that countries have been, you know, damaged by callous and uninformed, if not malicious, foreign intervention, and so I think I do think there's something about, and the regimes need to face their own people. You know, also it allows them to constantly fall into this nationalist discourse where you need to support us because someone outside is trying to tear us apart, is trying to force us to do something we don't want to do, is you know, is out to get us. You know, that whole nationalist discourse, there needs to be a reckoning with at some point, someday, where you can't get away, you know, with massacres and abuses because the state needs to be strong because there's outside forces trying to push us around. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it's good for people to maybe be disillusioned both with the external actors and then with this discourse where like everything is justified by the threat of external actors. I think countries in the region are very concerned with their image, which is obviously sort of a hangover of colonialism, among other things, and you know, is a mask for. I mean, regimes are very concerned with it. You know, they want to present themselves as modernizing and moderate, and there's a whole sort of PR for a whole set of countries where like they're, you know, they get to buy the weapons because they're the moderate regimes. I mean, you know. And there's a playing along with that goes on the part of Western countries, you know, of pretending to believe these claims, I think, because it facilitates commercial and other relations. And nobody's duped on either side. I think the question that this leaves, though, is like, you know, on government intervention, I don't know, but there have to be avenues for solidarity. Like people do care and want to follow, and we've seen these movements, and this is one of the things that I think is very challenging now, is how to express or enact any forms of solidarity with countries that are either, you know, very repressive, or like you say, where the people there are hesitant to engage, because their civil society engagement or artist engagement or academic engagement is viewed as suspicious and or not tolerated.
Thank you very much. And I now give a short 2 minutes to Stefano Torelli.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I will take advantage only of 1 minute. I think I would like to, yes, to come back to Ambassador Ferrara comments about what happened or is happening in Tunisia vis-a-vis or against what we project to what we want to happen in Tunisia. That's the real point. So I think that also from this point of view, yes, we as Westerns, I would say, we thought that a country like Tunisia was on the right pathway, and we decided not to spend enough time in supporting Tunisia and countries like Tunisia, whereas at the same time, this is, I think, the most dangerous thing to do. So keep thinking that a process like the so-called democratization process in Tunisia has already finished, and that we are taking for granted that, okay, we can close the Tunisian chapter and pass on and move on to the next chapter, whereas in the very same time, something is happening in a country like Tunisia, and it's not because we decided that Tunisian revolution is finished that it is actually happening. And the hundreds of thousands of people who in the last 2 years are escaping Tunisia and are fleeing Tunisia in order to reach Europe and Italy, or from Algeria and Morocco to Spain, all that people are there to remind us that something has still to happen in that countries, and we do not have to forget this.
Thank you very much. And I would like to take this moment to thank all of our speakers today. Of course, our last 3 panelists, but also the roundtables and panels held before, and the keynote speech by Soli Özel. We are very appreciative of all of your insights, and it has been a very rich discussion. I'm very happy that it's been recorded on YouTube, and we'll be able to make these conversations available for the future. I remind you to please join us again here tomorrow at the same time, which is 5 p.m. Rome time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard in the US. And that's plus or minus an hour, depending where you are. But we will be, the second day of our workshop is called The Tunisian Exception in Context. And we will have panels on the democratic construction site, on Tunisia as a democratic construction site, as well as a panel on political Islam and the regional environment. And finally, a roundtable entitled Tunisia as a Bridgehead to Africa and the Middle East. So we have a number of new speakers tomorrow, and we're very much looking forward to those conversations. And I would like to thank all of you for participating and attending and being such marvelous and active participants. And I wish you all a great end of day and a good rest, and look forward to continuing our conversation tomorrow. So thank you all.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.